on the way over here because he's coming from campus. But in any case, thought we would go ahead and prepare to fall on our swords here. So, yeah, how'd you like to start?
Here you all. Thanks for a great meeting. We had I think we had a productive closed session, and what I propose to do is read a bunch of logistical recommendations because it's efficient for us to talk about those things together. They're about style, and substantive technical comments again are going to follow in email, and I'll say something more about that.
Okay.
So first, I guess there's the issue about these aren't organized in any sensible way. There's the issue about the empty board seat, and it's the feeling of the board that we're already pretty big, and adding a voice isn't necessarily a good idea, but adding somebody whose expertise really complements what we're doing does make sense. And the whole that people talk about is a technologist who also knows something about privacy, and Lori Craner is a name that I think you've heard. So that's who we would like you to ask. But and if she says no, then we should look for other people in that category. But just to add another person doesn't seem all that beneficial. Okay. That's the sense of the board. The way that we talk, what we're going to do, and we've all agreed to, is send you email. Mm-hmm. And you may get 2 emails from some people. So if you get one email, that means those are comments that should be posted to the website.
Okay.
If somebody has out-of-band private comments that they don't want to be seen for reasons of politeness or whatever, mm-hmm. they'll send it to you in a second email.
That would make it much easier because, trying to deal with some of the issues or carve out specific pieces makes it a little tough. So
what we hope is going to happen with those is they'll get posted. We think what you do is you distribute it up your management chain, which by your management chain, we think it's Lipner and Scott.
Lipner, Charney, it will be Peter now, and Ira Rubenstein.
Right. And
at a minimum.
And we would also like them to go, or at least relevant excerpts, to MSR.
Okay.
So that Dan seems to have expressed an interest by his attendance. Mm-hmm. And there may be groups that the Palladium group ought to see the comments on Palladium. And
absolutely.
We'll count on you to make sure that the right groups see them.
Yeah, I was talking to John about that today, and I told him he could expect, whatever board commentary that came back to be passed on accordingly. So.
And to get a little bit ahead of myself, I think at each meeting, just as you did at this one, where you started by saying what of the issues that were brought up last time you've addressed, mm-hmm. we would like that kind of a status report.
Okay.
But this time, the status report was limited to the board on Moss comments, which was about agenda items. But you didn't say how the various technical items had been dealt with, which is to say, if somebody complained about some project, mm-hmm. we didn't hear back what the project did about that complaint. Mm-hmm. So we would like to hear about the impact or the lack of impact or the pushback for these things. Okay. And if it gets out of hand, that means there's too much, then we could imagine putting some annotations in the online web thing, and we'll before the meeting, and we'll look and notice which ones we think it's important to review. But it's important for us to get feedback on the technical comments to the groups or to MSR and so on, mm-hmm. since that will help us better understand how we can have an impact. And also, I think it'll force people to consider them a little bit more carefully.
Fair enough.
About some low-level details about meetings, it's probably a good idea if we have a real break that involves visiting the hotel between the end of the sessions and dinner.
I got that message from Deidre last night. So, yeah.
She wasn't the only one.
No, it's understandable.
And people seem to be more willing to stay late than get up early, so maybe the bus could leave at 8 a.m. rather than 7:30 a.m. in the morning.
Okay.
We talked a bit about what kind of sessions work and what don't work. And the consensus is the Palladium session was really a model of how we'd love all our sessions to go. And the key characteristics were there was high-level management of the project, both present and presenting. There was breadth from the group, both present. So it wasn't just one person, it was a bunch of people from the group. And that has two purposes. One is it allows us to have a diverse set of opinions from them. Second, it means a bunch of them hear us directly rather than having it translated. And part of the virtue we think of our discussions is that people hear our comments and the way we think about it. And if whoever presents goes back and recounts it, that's going to be less bandwidth than if a bunch of people hear it. So that was useful. There were interesting collateral viewers in the room, right? Dan Ling was here, so that kind of conveys a sense of seriousness that helps.
Along that line, Jeanette, you mentioned that before. The TAB meetings are essentially open to whomever unless they are specifically designated as closed sessions. Do you want that type of stuff?
We talked about that.
Okay.
We don't think that's a good idea. We do think it's a good idea to identify related people. So one of the things we're going to be thinking about when we work out the agenda for the next meeting is are there some people at MSR who, if they sat through the presentation, they would appreciate that there's a need to do some supporting research. Even if they're not doing the research, they should be the manager of the group where you would imagine that research happens. So we would like to invite some other people in Microsoft who could benefit from hearing the presentation, either because they need to be informed or because they could do something about it.
Okay.
And we're going to depend on you a lot to have that vision. We don't have.
For example, I could see Rich Draves or a few of the other, systems and architecture.
For instance, Amitabh would have benefited from the threat modeling discussion.
Or we could, kick it up even a higher level than that. Jack Breeze and Jim Kajia, and they have the director level folks in here as well. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, not a problem.
So we don't want to waste people's time.
Right.
We want to make sure a person who's here will really see that there's something they could do, and therefore it's worth coming.
Okay.
People feel that we'd all be more effective if we were a little bit better prepared for the presentations. So the guideline I heard was one airplane ride's worth of read-ahead material before the presentation. Now, these people, I know they didn't make their slides up 2 weeks in advance, in particular for this meeting. They probably took an old deck, but there's material that we could have been sent because they didn't prepare for it. And people will look it over or not, but we should have the option of doing that.
Understood. One thing that at least I was working off of with regards to specifically the Palladium session was, I believe I asked you, do you think there will be any pre-work necessary? And I believe you said if it goes the same way it did at the Summer Institute, we probably won't need it.
Right.
So that, there was that. Granted, the threat modeling stuff, Mike's got, and this is no rationalization. Mike's got a day job. I could have, kept the whip to him a little bit better on getting some pre-work done. But point taken.
Well, several of the presentations were, and I gave this presentation at X, was the introduction to it. So I'm not sure that they wouldn't have stuff. And I think a model that a Federal Express envelope's going to arrive, a few days before you have to get in the airplane, and it's got papers, so you just have to grab that, take it with, no matter what. It's an opportunity.
Sure.
Although electronic stuff has some value.
Well, I can do both. It's. Now, are you okay with the notion of leaving the stuff up on the website for you to download?
Yeah, that
as
would
opposed
be.
to
Just send a note reminding
send
us
a reminder.
which stuff.
Okay.
There should be a new subdirectory called Read Ahead for me.
Okay.
The suggestion was made that we go back to what we did last meeting in so far as trying to cluster the privacy content all on one day. the hope is that everyone's going to come for both days, but it gives the attorneys an opportunity to only come for one day if their schedule doesn't work out. That seems like it's not so hard to do.
Okay.
I already mentioned that we do want to get feedback on our technical comments. We talked a bit about how to give a talk, and we were hoping that we would distribute to speakers beforehand some guidelines about how to make the best use of the time they spend in a session. Things like plan to only talk for half the scheduled time, promise that we'll not interrupt for 30 minutes, require that the speaker tell us what questions they want us to answer based on their talk, tell us, we'll tell them who's on the board. We don't know if these speakers understand who we are, what our backgrounds are, what our perspectives are. So you have bios for us.
I do.
We'd like to know when somebody starts, where they sit in the organization, and what their expectation is for product or not, and so on. What we'd like you to talk a little bit about, but you don't have to do it right now, but you do have to do it this afternoon, is what your plans were for the reliability discussions. We know you had an emphasis on reliability. For example, if you were thinking in terms of doing a briefing on prefix and prefast, then most of us think that's unnecessary since we've all seen it a bunch of times. If there's other stuff, then we should.
Well, Steve and I had actually, we sat down and had realized that up to this point, reliability was sort of getting the short shrift. So we hadn't, other than recognizing the notion that we needed to get SOMA, who's the executive sponsor for reliability, involved and get his perspectives on the questions that group and that particular problem set needed answering. We hadn't taken it to anything really particular yet. As far as
there are like two reliability areas that are intuitively of large value. One has to do with Watson technology. So, Watson's the crash reporting tool. But what's of more interest to me long term is how that type of technology can be expanded to catch other kinds of reliability issues other than system crashes, right, which are pretty dramatic. But in theory, the tool could end up in every product and cross-correlate across products what's going on in a computer system and give us all sorts of new insights into why they fail and how to fail gracefully.
So that sounds like there's an interesting privacy component to that.
That's not bad. So the way Watson works today is, because the dump may include memory, and memory may include PII depending on what you're working on, you can actually see the report before you decide to send it. And, I don't know that we have any valid statistical sampling on how many people look at the report, decide not to send it because I have looked at the report very often, especially if I'm because I'm using a Microsoft asset. It always has my username listed in the report somewhere. And I don't care because I'm a Microsoft employee at Microsoft, and even if I'm on my own time, I use my laptop for online banking, I still want them to figure out what's going on. I'm happy to have attribution, but that's me because I work here. But there are privacy issues. And the other question is, so Watson's being used for reliability, but to what extent could it be used in other areas of trustworthy computing? And to maybe find security things before anyone realized that's actually a crash that could be caused, for example, by a person. So one area is Watson. The other area that I think might have some value is we've started to do more work on engineering excellence building code. Looking at engineering practices across the company to see to what extent it's consistent, should be made consistent, recognizing that we have a lot of different components in the company. But you think about building houses, there are both regulatory building codes imposed by governments, but there's also just best practices that people use to decide how, and I think we have not across the company focused enough attention on harmonizing our standards for developers. And we're starting to look at that stuff. And I wonder if there wouldn't be something interesting there with John Devon and David Greenspoon.
Well, I bet there would be some research people that we would want to listen.
Probably Emin and a few of the other folks that are working on Strider, and a few of those things might, they might be interested in attending as well. Now, just for clarity's sake, are we considering from a technical perspective that reliability includes things like fault tolerance and because most of what we heard over here has sort of more of a policy-esque type bent to it.
He's talking about software engineering.
Well, I mean, yeah, but at the end of the day, do you want to see specific technologies that are feeding into that's the heart of my question is like, are there specific technologies that you would want to see?
I think we're interested in all of it: life cycle, technology, tools, and vision. Mostly vision. Where are you moving to?
But it sounds like Watson and the Excellence building code is a half a day easily, and there's not a passion here that we learn about fault-tolerant computing at the next meeting.
Understood. Just wanted to know if there were technology, specific technologies that you wanted to know about, or what have you. So.
So the third issue I'm just thinking about out loud is what we call zero-touch deployment. I mean, one of the problems is we're building products that are arguably more secure than anything we've built before. Service packs, of course, have a number of security things built into them. So we want customers to migrate to the newest stuff, right? And for better reliability, better security, all that stuff. Leaving aside the cost dynamics, it turns out that a lot of our enterprise agreements, actually, they paid a ton of money and have the right to upgrade to all this stuff. They're not doing it. When you ask them, why don't you do it? It's too expensive and too hard. We need zero-touch deployment. We need to be able to get from 2K to 2003 server at the push of a button, or at least something far more tolerable than today.
I wonder, talk about the dark, seamy underside of the business. I wonder if we ought to also expose them to the sustained engineering. Patch management, patch quality.
Patch quality
is part of that. Deployment was the thing that made me think about that. But patch quality, patch deployment, patch quality. This whole business of why do. Another aspect. We go through fits because customers stay on the N-2 or N-3 service pack for years, and so then when we do issue security patches, they can't install them.
I don't know what to do about it either.
Upgrade.
Reformat, reinstall. Yeah.
So we have to make the upgrade process more painless. It's an engineering problem.
Okay.
That really is.
It's a good idea.
You have.
It really is because people. The service packs and patches are free. The reason people don't roll them out is A, because it's expensive to roll them out, and B, because they're afraid they'll break apps, and those are both engineering issues.
Right.
Okay, so then switching gears, there are some suggestions for agenda next time and some feedback that we'd like. Everybody counseled me that I should ask this question now so you can think about the answer. We have spent a fair bit of time trying to decide whether we're doing a decent job and what our role is. And so what we'd like to ask you is to tell us what you're getting out of this. And now I'll talk to you for a while you think about that answer. And then we hope maybe by the end of our session now some of the Microsoft people could say what it is you're getting out of it and also what you hope to get out of it in the future. And we're not talking about specific technical things, but rather the style and the nature of the comments we deliver. For the future, we'd like Peter to give us his vision and report on the current state of affairs. We think we'd like to have a session on the Longhorn architecture. What's the security architecture? What's the privacy architecture? What's the plans for life cycle for this thing? But we don't want to hear a lot of details about features. We want to hear about the architecture. And if that's a really short talk, then it's telling you something, right? There were a bunch of privacy questions that came up. A follow-up with Jeff, in particular, what happened to the media player. There is the issue about the sociological threat analysis and Palladium that we may want to follow up on. At the last meeting, we talked about a privacy push analogous to the security push, where there's a set of processes that programmers go through to make sure that their code has reasonable privacy. We'd like to hear about that, and also to have a discussion about whether you believe things are going to break when they become privacy certified, if you'll let me misuse that word. And what is we don't really understand Microsoft's agenda about privacy. We understand it about the security agenda, but not the privacy agenda. It seems like it's an independent initiative. It sometimes is an afterthought, but it's certainly not linked to security and less linked to software development. And so I think that a discussion about that would be helpful. Maybe we're uninformed, and it may be not.
Get your homework there, Peter.
It'd be useful to have a discussion probably about web services. And we pick that because we believe we're better off talking and listening to things that are in the early stages of development rather than things that are fairly far advanced. And there's a belief that the web services business is fairly early. We could have an impact there.
Yellow, sharp.
Chris Taylor.
Probably not Felipe Cabrera.
Okay.
Because we heard him some of us heard him on Monday, and that led me to believe that the level wouldn't be quite right.
Well, Chris was actually part of the standards effort for our web services push. So, yeah, there's quite a few people.
The team working with IBM and the web standards.
So maybe let me throw the floor open first for other board members if I've left anything out, and then second, because to the Microsoft people, because we'd love for you to tell us what you're getting out of this. Is it living up to your expectations and so on? Are there any other comments from the board?
So the expectation thing, there are two things I can say. So one is my perspective, and then one, I'm going to put the second one first. Okay, the second thing that I would say, which might surprise you, is to some extent I'm not the right person to ask this question. I say that because what I really want to hear is from John Manfredelli, for example, and from Michael Howard, to what extent they're assimilating the input from the board into the next generation of what they're doing.
And we want to hear this too, which is why we're asking.
And because, leaving aside the fact that some of this, is at a technical level other than where I'm at, and some of it also I'm in and out, we really need to go back to them and say, was this useful for you? What was the takeaways you got from it? Do you want to, as you revise things, come back to the group and all that stuff? What I take away from this, which is helpful, is the higher level policy and direction of the company stuff. For example, in your statement before about the privacy agenda, I think that's absolutely right. I think that is where we are, that it has been, and to some extent will remain secondary to privacy and security in the short term. And the reason for that is that you just have to listen to your customers to know what's driving them wacky. And you also have to remember that you've got customers like Bank of America that says, we don't need Microsoft's help doing privacy. We have Graham Leach Bliley. We give our customers privacy notices. We know how to handle the privacy issue. You, Microsoft, aren't even as good at this as we are. We don't need your help. So the privacy stuff for us becomes privacy in products and services, the services that we run, the MSN, the Hotmail, and all that. And on the product side, what I would say is, to some extent, it is more challenging to get developers ginned up over privacy than security. Because right now, at least, they see security as a technical challenge, and a lot of privacy issues are social values that are non-binary.
Except we appreciate that privacy is an even harder technical problem.
I understand that, and I can tell you that we are starting to do things in the privacy front. So one of the things to be effective from a management cultural change perspective is you have to do things in ways and say things in ways that people are able to assimilate it and hear it. So, for example, a privacy problem used to be a privacy problem. Now it's a privacy bug that gets tracked like any other engineering bug. Okay? Because developers understand bugs, and if they know they have to clear the bugs before they can ship the product, that helps. And in OTG, where they're now doing a privacy review of all the internal applications, they have a severity rating for privacy bugs. You know, there's a sensitive PII, regular PII, potential PII, but there's none there. And based on the severity, you have X days to remediate, or at least have a remediation plan in place. And we're starting to do more parallelism between the security effort and the privacy effort, not only so that they get it in ways that they understand it, but to the extent you have to change a corporate culture to a new model, it's much easier for people to learn one model and apply it in many pillars than to learn 4 different models, right? And so we have a documented information security program that's being deployed throughout the company. One of the things I've talked to Peter about is the documented information privacy program, which is when you've read one, the other will be different in substance, but the format should look familiar. Shall, must, may should look familiar. You know, the metrics that we use to measure you should look familiar, those kinds of things. But to be frank, I don't see, and Peter and I talked about this actually when we were driving back in one of the breaks, we're going to ratchet up privacy considerably this year. And that's one of the reasons Peter's here. I would not say that I would expect privacy to reach the level of security this year. I also think, however, that as we are successful in tackling other issues, privacy, which is important, will not rise up, but the other things will come down, and privacy comparatively will become more important. What I mean by that is, so patch management was a huge issue, and it remains a huge issue. But we've done a lot of work in this space. We've published a white paper, and now when I talk to customers, they go, yeah, patch management's a mess, but you're on the right path. You understand it's a problem. We've read the white paper. You've got a roadmap. We want to talk to you about zero-touch deployment. We can't upgrade your stuff. And you go, what about patch management? No, you're getting a handle on that. This is the next big problem, right? And so I expect by default, privacy, which is always of theoretical concern and practical concern to some people, will get more attention in the year ahead. And when I say theoretical concern, I can, in Alan Weston's scale, I'm between a pragmatist and a fundamentalist. And far from it, I don't care. But what I mean is, notwithstanding my personal feelings, I just see people getting Safeway cards and shopper affiliation cards and giving up information on a dime. And, you know, it's fine to rant and rave about privacy, but when you look at the market...
People used to smoke in restaurants, too.
That's right.
But if indeed the next year is a time when you are ramping up the privacy initiative, then that would suggest that you need to suggest to us how we can be involved in the early phases so that where you're going, it profits from the wisdom of the expertise on the board.
So one of the interesting things that I've started to think about is if you're threat modeling your products and you're doing data flows as part of the threat model for security, that same data flow can do the threat model for privacy. And you can tell the security push team, listen, as long as you're modeling data flows, ask the additional question, is it PII, and what does that mean, right? So I think this is the time to talk about this in greater earnest, and I think we can come up with an interesting agenda, like maybe even with some overview of historically where we've been, where we feel we are today, what the plan is for the future. And it would be a little more high level than the bore down into Palladium, because we'd be starting this issue kind of new. And then we could bore down on the issues that seem to resonate the most as raising interesting issues.
But and your comments though were about content, and the question was about meta content. Are we doing the right thing? Is the idea that we take speakers and ask them questions and drive them around good? Would you rather be hearing us make presentations? Would you rather be telling you what Microsoft Research should be doing and ignoring product groups? I mean, there's a long list of things we could be doing, and it would be interesting to know what you think we are doing. I know you'll ask the people who presented to us whether they got something out of it, but beyond that, what do you see a role for us?
All right, so I would say a couple of things. One is we are a company that develops products and services. And at the end of the day, that is what is our touch point with all our customers and with the public. So to the extent that your input designs a better Palladium, right, or creates a better threat model so our products are more secure, that to me is job one for this group. Job two, and that's a little product-centric for me, two is the Microsoft Research element. I think part of the difficulty, which Dave talked about and we're working on now, is trying to better catalog the trustworthy computing elements of MSR. Because one of the big issues is, are we investing in the right areas, developing the right kinds of things, right? And I don't think we focused enough on the long-term privacy and security research agenda. I don't think the board has. And I don't think the board has done it because we haven't been clear about what our agenda is. And as we started delving into this post the last meeting, I think what we found is we have more of an ad hoc approach to things of interest as opposed to a trustworthy computing research agenda. So before the board can be of value there, we have to get our ducks in a row, and that will happen between this meeting and the next meeting. Products and services that I guess the other area where the board is being helpful and can continue to be helpful is the broader policy issues. So it came up a little bit when there was this discussion of Palladium and China and dissidents, right? I can tell you at a high level what Microsoft's policy on privacy is, for example, which is to create choice but not dictate the solution. So you can create a technology that tracks people, or you can create it so that it creates anonymity, or you can create it so that you can turn it on and off and leave it to the users of the technology to decide if they want to track each other, track their employees or not. And the employees and the employers can fight about whether there should be surveillance, and they can work it out through their own corporate or political process, right? I think historically, because of our market share, we are really loath to suggest what the answer should be. And I think that's why with some of the stuff like Palladium, you see this very careful dance about, yes, technology should not dictate social policy. But when you have large market share, technology can dictate social policy. We saw it in the encryption debate. So you can say, look, encryption, cat's out of the bag. Encryption's going to be everywhere. Terrorists are going to use it. It doesn't matter that there are wiretapping laws and anti-terrorism laws. The technology says bad guys can have this stuff. The flip side, of course, is to do something else and create the opposite problem. The good guys can't use crypto to protect privacy, and dissidents can't use it to protect their communications from an abusive government and all of that. And so historically, Microsoft's view is, okay, we make crypto available. There's an EFS, but we don't say every file shall be encrypted or no file shall be encrypted. We go, do what you want. You decide the social policy, whichever one you decide, it works. And I think in the privacy sphere, I mean, to some extent, of course, we're in line with safe harbor, fair information principles, and we do have as a corporate policy giving people more control over their data and data about them in their relationship with us. But when it comes to things like Palladium or media player, do you want enriched content or not, we could have protected your privacy by simply providing that no PII is collected past whatever. And you know what, we won't even let you get enriched content because there's a risk somebody could figure out a way to track your activities. We're just going to make it play the CD and that's it. So we have the philosophy. The question is the philosophy right? I tend to think it is. But more importantly, how do you actually take that philosophy and design it into products and services in a fair and accurate way? Because you can have the policy, but in the implementation, fail to adhere to the policy. Just like you can have a security policy and nobody follows it. So to the extent that there are those kinds of policy discussions, they're worthwhile. Because at the end of the day, so I'm very practical about this. At the end of the day, you build something. And there's a finite number of features that can end up in the thing. That's all there is to it. And, you know, I've had this discussion on IP. I was at this conference and someone said to me, all this digital rights management, you're taking the side of the IP provider, right? The IP rights holder. And I said, actually, you could make the other argument. Computers in Microsoft, they built this thing called DOS, and it had copy A:, B:. So actually, we took the side of the infringer. You had to take a side. The only thing is, it wasn't necessarily an informed side. When they wrote A copy B, copy A:, B:, they didn't say, now what will this mean for the IP industry? They just built it. Now people start saying, was that the right thing to build? And then when you nail it all down at the end of the day, it's, to me, a very simple question. So I was chief of the intellectual property section. I'm a fan of IP rights. I think it's capitalistic. I don't know why I should have to pay for a car and not pay for IP just because it's intangible. I understand the tangible. It all boils down to one question. Is there a way to protect fair use? That's the only question. Someone can figure out a way to give people IP rights and still institute through technological design fair use. The whole issue goes away. So you can copy this song to give it to your whatever, to put it on your other mobile device, but you can't just post it on the internet, whatever you like that one. But we're taking sides in that debate. You can't not. To abstain is to take a side. Right? So there are always going to be those questions in privacy and security as well. Do you turn on logging for security or leave it off for privacy? You're in the debate.
Can I add something to that?
Well, I think we'd like to hear from all the Microsoft people.
One of the, and we got partially into it yesterday when we got into the dilemma debate about how do you actually communicate and what level do you make a notice of consent. One of the striking differences between security and privacy from my standpoint, and I think this is an area that the board can play a measurable part about it. Scott talked about it in terms of the design of products and services. Think about design. One way to think about design is in the reliability and the security side of the TWC. When you get to the privacy side, it enters into another interesting dilemma: is how do you market it? I mean, marketing in the sense of how you communicate with the client. And I think that being instructive in terms of helping us think through some of those things, and perhaps even instructive in terms of helping Microsoft research think about how we might want to approach that in a much more integrated, would be extremely helpful. In other words, inside the organization, we can have some marvelous esoteric discussions about where does security stop and privacy start. But at the end of the day, the customer doesn't differentiate that. So how do you sort of communicate that to make your products that much more appealable? And the interesting part about the privacy debate is that what might work for Fred may not work for Scott. So how do you do that in a software world where you don't have that ability to have one-to-one marketing
for that side of things. So I that would be extremely instrumental. Maybe we can sort of tease that out a little bit more in the next session once you sort of hear a little bit about kind of our vision for privacy, because it isn't just about a risk avoidance strategy in my mind. It's about how can privacy be used to enable the sale of products and services to make the customer experience a lot richer.
I will say too, for David, there's also an issue about we need to talk about privacy architecture, because the OS is horizontal, but a lot of privacy is done in line of business applications that are vertical. And one of our challenges is how much should the OS, like when you get to Longhorn, should Longhorn be able to deny a vertical line of business application, PII? Where should the decision be made? On what product, at what level? And should it even be Microsoft's product? We're struggling with that. You know, so Office has a lot of metadata on a file. Who created it, and how, when it was revised, modified, comments, all that stuff. So is Office responsible for all that PII? One answer is yes. But if Office has this, and WordPerfect has this, and another app has this, and PowerPoint has this, and all that, should the OS be enforcing any privacy? It enforces security rules. You can't run any line of business app onto the OS. And so if you have robust or biometrics for log on, you can't get anywhere else until you do that as a minimum. So there are some architecture issues about where the privacy protections belong and what that would mean to the market. Because you can see a lot of our competitors saying you're interfering with our relationship with our customer.
Steve? A couple things. Number one, one of my goals for the next, we do goals in our HR system. One of my goals for the next year is to be at one of these meetings without, and sit through it without being called out for some operational thing. I was closer this time than I was at the January meeting, but I'm still not completely shed of some of the other stuff I'm doing. So I will follow up with Mike and Fez and see how they felt that the feedback went during their sessions and to what extent that helped them. From my perspective, a couple of things.
Actually, you might want to wait until we get our comments to David, he gets the comments to them, because that...
Absolutely. But the real-time interaction is also an interesting data point separately. And so I'll even close that loop with them. I mean, it's not a big deal. I won't cross-talk. I'll close that loop with them even beforehand. From my perspective, it's useful even being here as much as I am, because this board asks questions that wouldn't occur to people even with alleged, or that don't occur to people even with alleged strategy jobs as they get wrapped up in the press of day-to-day business. And a couple of things that hit me just from the conversation yesterday morning. One of them is that this whole business of threat modeling is really sort of glorifying flaw hypothesis, trying to do it in a systematic way, the systematic and pervasive way, and that comes back. Flaw hypothesis is for breaking into systems, not making them secure. The question is, what should we be doing? Are there things that we should be doing, that are more effective from the standpoint of eliminating finding them? You have to find them first, but that may be an inefficient process, so there are more efficient things to do. Now, turn that around. If you have suggestions, we're interested in hearing them. But even just hearing the question, being reminded of the question, is helpful from my perspective. The other thing, that you focused on, we've told you what we're doing, is the metrics stuff. I mean, we measure what we can measure, but I think everybody in the room, everybody who's been trying to do security for a long time in the room, knows that measuring security is really hard. And I think that that's a problem I would like to see us work together over the next, as long as it takes until we have a better handle on that. It may be that the bulletin rate drops off, and that's good enough. At some level it is. But I'd like to have something that I felt was a more defensible measure to work from. I mean, I told one of the vice presidents that if our market share dropped to 10%, our bulletin rate would drop concomitantly. But that's not the way I'd like to solve that problem. And so, given that we're big, how do we measure how well we're doing? I think it is useful. I think y'all have a lot to offer and a lot to help us with. I will be pushing to get additional topics on the agenda, at the next meeting or two. I'll look at the feedback when you send it, and we'll try to work together with Scott and Dave to make sure that we get useful input from you. Well, people at the meetings are folks I certainly respect, and respect that even the real-time comments are helpful. So we want to make as much use of your input as we can. Really focus more on the development operational side. We can get MSR spun up to provide additional help. That's useful too, but I am very much focused on the product side of the company.
Well, from my perspective, Steve sort of hit both of them right on the head. For me, I am interested in having access to contrarian viewpoints. It's essentially what this is a sobriety check for Microsoft on a variety of different levels. If we're up here and we're presenting something and we are missing something that is patently obvious, well then, by God, I would hope that you folks would call us on it. So, I mean, that's a major motivation for what I'm doing. But as the content refines itself and the board interaction refines itself, I'd also like to try to find out if there are things that can be teased out into interesting research venues. Since I am at MSR, I have a little bit more of a long-term, non-product-driven perspective, and if there are questions that need to be answered that may not necessarily have a life in a product group yet, I think in many cases it's my job to try to get those things moving. And then the other thing too is as Steve said, I would like to, on a variety of different topics, be able to achieve a level of intellectual defensibility for some of the things that we're doing. If we're doing things that are out front on a particular issue, there may not be any sort of body of law, if you will, to sit there and say what is right or what is wrong. But if we can demonstrate that we've at least put a significant amount of thought and effort into achieving a solution, that is better than just sort of hoping for the best. And by interacting with you folks, it gives us a wider viewpoint of the different vectors that we may be questioned on in the future. And then I've also got, with many of you, personal research relationships, and a lot of that a lot of the things that I feel over the long term that we discuss in here may in fact lead to richer research relationships back at your home institutions. And so that's pretty much. I'll keep it short, but those are the things that I could probably go on for a long time on all of those. But those are the things that pretty much drove me about this. And when I presented those to Scott and Steve and at that point Richard Purcell and Ira, I mean it wasn't like I had to convince anyone. So I think we're all sort of singing from the same song sheet, but just looking at it from different angles. So
I just echo one thing about that, which is we have a Chief Security Officers Council that we meet with twice a year. They're customers. They represent markets. The problem is markets are really imperfect at dealing with these kinds of issues, in a way, right? If you think of, you look at wireless security, right? Everybody wanted it's really convenient. Security stinks. Everybody's using it anyway. And so the goal for us is to try and get a more pure, what's the right direction than markets will give us. because markets don't do this well. That's my own 19 years of government speaking.
Okay, with that, any other questions, comments?
Thanks for hosting us. The good
I think that
news.
was very helpful to hear what you're getting out of it.
And there is definite value. I mean, a cynic could look at this as, Microsoft doing something insidious, and I've gotten that feedback from a lot of different people. But at the flip side, I said, take a look at the composition of the board, and if you think there are any Microsoft yes men in there, I'll let you bring it up with them personally. And at that point, that usually ends. That usually ends the discussion.
The single aspect was that, we demanded actually senior management presence for the 2 days, and the last thing I didn't want to hear, well, I had to sit here in this stupid meeting for 2 days. I actually wanted you guys to get something out of it, even if it's real-time questions and answers. And that, to me, is valuable. Then we really are serving a valuable purpose, because then you can filter that down.
Right. The biggest problem is the one Steve mentioned, which is really hard to be on campus and not get sidewhacked by stuff.
Right.
Well, there's some people who got to grab cabs and drive and such, so why don't we go ahead and break for this, and thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.